everybody, and welcome to the Paranormal Portal. I'm your host, Brent Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got an epic show ahead, but just remember, if any of you have experiences you'd like to share, I'd love to hear from you. You can either email me at paranormalportalradio@gmail.com or head over to paranormalportal.net and scroll down and find the button that says Interview Me, and that'll allow you to look at a calendar of possible times and dates and find a date that works for you. Love to hear your stories, so definitely get in touch with me. Most people have an idea in their head of what a frightening encounter is supposed to sound like. They imagine shouting, running, something loud or chaotic that's over quickly, leaving behind more adrenaline than clarity. But many of the accounts we're talking about tonight don't follow that pattern. In a lot of these cases, nothing dramatic happens at first. The witness is usually doing something ordinary, driving a familiar road, checking on animals, sitting on a porch, or walking through property that they've been on countless times before. There's no expectation that anything unusual is about to occur. What they describe instead is noticing something that doesn't quite sit right. It might be movement in an area where they don't expect it, or a shape that doesn't behave the way wildlife in that region normally does. Often the first reaction isn't fear, but confusion, followed by an attempt to explain it away as something mundane. Several witnesses talk about these few seconds where they're actively trying to force the situation to make sense. They tell themselves it's just a large dog, or trick of the lights, or an odd angle caused by distance. Some even look away and then look back, expecting that whatever they saw to just correct itself. In many reports, it doesn't. What tends to unsettle people most isn't an immediate threat or an aggressive action. It's the realization that whatever they're looking at appears to be aware of them and responding to their presence in a very deliberate way. Not rushing, not reacting unpredictably, but simply remaining there as if it's assessing the situation. That detail comes up repeatedly in reports from different parts of the country and from different decades. The people describing these encounters don't use the same language, and they often don't know about other cases at the time that they come forward. But the way they explain that moment is strikingly similar. And for many of them, that's the point where the fear actually begins. Not because something happens, but because something doesn't. Because the situation lingers longer than it should, and the normal explanations stop working. Tonight's episode focuses on reported encounters like that, accounts that stayed with the people who experienced them long after the moment passed, and in some cases changed the way they felt about places they once considered safe and familiar. Most often, many reported Dogman encounters don't begin with fear. They often begin with familiarity. The witness is usually somewhere that they know really well, a place they've driven through dozens of times, land they've worked on, hunted on, or lived beside for years. And that familiarity is important because it's often what allows them to say with confidence that what they saw didn't belong there. One of the more frequently cited regions of these kinds of reports is Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It's remote, heavily wooded, sparsely populated in places, and home to wildlife that most residents are accustomed to seeing. Large wolves, black bear, moose, and none of those would normally cause someone to freeze in place. The first encounter tonight comes from a man who lived in the Upper Peninsula most of his life. He was familiar with the roads, the distances between the towns, and the way the animals behaved near them. He wasn't looking for anything unusual the night that this happened. He was driving home late, just before midnight, along a 2-lane road bordered by dense forest on both sides. There were no streetlights, only his headlights and the occasional reflective marker along the shoulder. According to his report, traffic that night was non-existent, and the drive was routine enough that he wasn't really even paying close attention. Well, that changed when he noticed movement ahead on the right side of the road. At first, he just assumed it was a deer approaching the shoulder, which wasn't at all unusual. He slowed down slightly, expecting it to bolt across the road or retreat into the trees, and instead, the shape moved parallel to his vehicle, staying just inside the tree line. What caught his attention wasn't the size, though he said that it was large, but the way it moved. He described it as upright but slightly hunched, covering ground far too smoothly to be someone walking along the roadside. As he slowed further, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, the shape stepped closer to the edge of the trees. His headlights fully illuminated it for several seconds. This was the moment, he later said, changed everything. He reported seeing a tall, upright figure covered in dark hair with long arms that hung lower than any human's proportions would allow. The head shape didn't resemble a bear, and it didn't resemble any breed of dog he was familiar with. The face, according to his account, had a pronounced muzzle and pointed ears set high on the head. What unsettled him the most wasn't the appearance alone, but the way the figure reacted to the vehicle. It didn't flinch, it didn't retreat, and it didn't seem surprised. Instead, it slowed its pace, matching the speed of his truck, remaining just far enough back that it stayed partially obscured by the trees, while still clearly visible in the headlights. The witness said he became aware of how quiet everything suddenly felt. No insects, no wind noise, just the sound of his engine and the tires on the pavement. Well, he didn't stop the vehicle, and he didn't accelerate either. He later explained that he felt locked into watching that thing, afraid that if he made any sudden move, the situation would change in a way he couldn't control. After several seconds, though, he couldn't say exactly how long, the figure veered back into the forest, disappearing behind the trees without making any noticeable sound. He continued driving, but he didn't relax. He checked his mirrors repeatedly, expecting to see the movement again. And when he reached home, he stayed in his truck for several minutes before even going inside, scanning the tree line around his property. He told no one about the encounter for years, not because he wanted attention, but because he didn't know how to explain what he'd seen without it sounding impossible. He was certain that it wasn't a wolf. He was equally certain that it wasn't a person in a costume, especially given the speed, proportions, and the location. What stayed with him, he later said, was the sense that the figure had noticed him long before he noticed it, and that whatever it was, it had chosen not to close that distance. The next report is also from the upper Midwest and shares a similar starting point, but a very different setting. The witness was checking the perimeter of a rural property late in the evening after repeated disturbances to livestock fencing. The area was heavily wooded, with open fields bordering by tree lines that dropped off into thicker forest beyond. He was carrying a flashlight and a rifle, more out of habit than expectation, and assumed he was dealing with coyotes or stray dogs or something. Well, as he approached the far end of the property, he noticed movement near the fence line ahead. He initially believed it was a large dog standing on its hind legs, possibly trying to get over the fence. When he shined his light directly on it, he realized that explanation just didn't hold. The figure was already upright, standing still, and it was facing him. He described the height as well over 7 feet, with shoulders broader than any man and arms that extended unusually far down to its sides. The head was angled slightly downward, but the eyes reflected the flashlight clearly. He said the eye shine was not like that of a deer or a raccoon. It was steady and fixed and didn't waver as the light remained on it. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The witness later said he became aware of how exposed he felt standing in the open field, with the forest behind the figure stretching back into darkness. He also became aware that the thing hadn't approached the fence or even tried to cross it. It was just simply standing there. After what he estimated was less than a minute, the figure turned and walked back into the trees on 2 legs, disappearing into the forest without breaking stride or even dropping down to all 4s. The witness immediately returned to his house, locked the doors, and he didn't check the fence again that night. In the weeks that followed, he reported hearing movement along the tree line at night, always just out of sight. He never saw the figure again, but he said the sense of being watched lingered whenever he went outside after dark. Eventually, he installed additional lighting around the property and stopped checking the perimeter fence alone. In accounts like these, the encounter itself is brief. Nothing violent had occurred. No chase takes place. But the realization that sets in afterward is difficult for many witnesses to shake. The understanding that something was there, close enough to observe them clearly, and capable of remaining unseen until it chose otherwise. And that, for reasons unknown, it decided to remain at a distance. For some witnesses, the encounter ends there. They see something they can't explain, they carry it with them, and life eventually settles back into something that resembles normal. But for others, that moment isn't the end of the experience. It's the point where they begin to realize that whatever they encountered didn't simply pass through the area and didn't simply move on. In the next accounts, the sightings don't happen once, and they don't happen at a distance, and they don't stay confined to the edge of the woods. For some witnesses, the unsettling part of the experience isn't the moment they see something unusual. It's what happens after. In these reports, the encounter doesn't stay contained to a single place or even a single night. The witness begins to notice patterns, movement that repeats, sounds that occur at consistent times, and the growing sense that whatever they encountered has not left their area. One of the more disturbing reports comes from a rural property in Wisconsin, where a family had lived for several years without any incident. Their home sat on a large parcel of land bordered on 3 sides by forest, with a gravel driveway that ran nearly a quarter mile to the main road. The first incident was minor enough that they really didn't think much of it. The father reported hearing movement along the tree line late at night while taking the garbage out. He assumed it was just a deer or coyotes, which were common in the area. Over the next several evenings, however, the sounds continued, always slow, heavy steps, and always staying just inside of the trees. What had stood out to him was that the movement would stop whenever he stopped. If he remained still, the sound would remain still as well. At first, he didn't mention that to anyone else in the house. Well, a few nights later, his teenage son came inside after letting the dog out and asked if someone had been walking around the edge of the property. He said he'd heard something moving parallel to him as he crossed the yard, matching his pace until he reached the porch. The dog had refused to leave the steps that night and had to be carried back inside. Over the next week, similar incidents occurred. Movement was heard along the fence line that separated the yard from the woods. The sounds were described as deliberate and heavy, but never rushed. On 2 occasions, the father reported hearing what he thought was breathing coming from the tree line while standing on the porch. When he shined a light in that direction, the sound stopped immediately. Well, the family began leaving the porch lights on that night. Several days later, the father noticed tracks along the edge of the yard where the grass met the forest. Well, he was familiar with animal tracks and just couldn't identify them. The impressions were deep. They were bipedal and spaced farther apart than he could have expected from a person walking. What unsettled him most was the direction of travel. The tracks ran back and forth along the property line as though something had been pacing it. The following night, he finally saw it. He was standing at the kitchen window looking out into the yard shortly after midnight when movement near the tree line caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a bear standing upright. That assumption lasted only a few seconds. The figure stepped forward enough to be partially illuminated by the porch light. It was tall, covered in dark hair, and standing on 2 legs. The arms hung low, nearly to its knees, and the head appeared canine in shape, the pointed ears visible against the lighter background of the yard. He said the figure remained there for several seconds, not advancing, not retreating. It was just standing there. He woke his wife and brought her to the window, and she later confirmed seeing the same thing. Neither of them reported feeling panicked in that moment. Instead, they described a heavy sense of unease, paired with the realization that whatever they were seeing had been close to the house on previous nights without being visible. After several seconds, the figure stepped backward into the trees and just disappeared. Well, they didn't call the police, and they did not go outside. They spent the rest of that night awake. In the days that followed, the activity continued, but the sightings did not. The sounds returned along the tree line, sometimes on one side of the property, sometimes on the other. On more than one occasion, the father reported hearing movement near the back of the house after dark, followed by silence once he turned on the exterior lights. Well, the family eventually installed additional lighting and security cameras. Nothing was ever captured on video, but the sounds continued until early winter when snowfall covered the ground and the activity gradually stopped. They eventually sold the property the following spring. Another report involves a hunter in northern Ohio who experienced repeated encounters over the course of several weeks. He was hunting on public land he had used for years and was familiar with the terrain and the wildlife patterns. During one outing, he noticed that what he assumed was a large dog was moving through the woods at a distance. The movement was smooth and upright at times, dropping behind cover before he could go get a clear look. Over the next several trips, he noticed the same thing. Movement that seemed to mirror his own path through the forest. Sounds of footsteps that would stop when he stopped. On one occasion, he reported hearing something moving quickly through the brush on his right, only to hear it again moments later on his left, further ahead. He began carrying his rifle at the ready rather than slung over his shoulder. The encounter escalated one evening as he was walking back towards his truck near dusk. He became aware of the movement behind him, followed by the distinct sound of something exhaling forcefully. When he turned, he saw a tall, dark figure standing between two trees approximately 40 yards away. He described the head as distinctly canine, with a long muzzle and ears that stood upright. The body was broad and muscular, covered in dark hair, and it was upright. The figure did not move towards him. Instead, it took several steps sideways, keeping the same distance, remaining partially obscured by the trees. Well, the witness backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off of it, until he finally reached his truck. He got inside, locked the doors, before starting the engine. As he drove away, he reported seeing the figure emerge from the tree line and stand at the edge of the clearing, watching the vehicle leave. Well, he did not ever return to that area. And in encounters like these, the fear doesn't come from sudden aggression. It comes from repetition. From the realization that the experience is unfolding over time and that the witness is no longer stumbling into something by chance. They're being followed, observed, and in some cases, approached gradually. By the time these witnesses realize what's happening, they also realize something else. Whatever is out there knows the terrain far better than they do. In some reported encounters, the sense of being watched never stays at the edge of the woods. It moves closer. The witnesses in these cases don't describe something passing through or keeping to the tree line. They describe a presence that seems to understand where people live, how they move through their homes, and when they're the most vulnerable. One of the more unsettling reports comes from a rural farmhouse in Kentucky where a couple and their young child lived at the end of a long wooded road. Their nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the property backed up directly to dense forest. The first incident happened late at night when the husband was awakened by the sound of something moving along the side of the house. Well, he assumed it was a raccoon or maybe just a stray dog until the footsteps stopped directly beneath the bedroom window. Well, he stayed still, just listening. And after several seconds, he heard what he described as slow, deliberate breathing coming from just outside. Not panting, not sniffing or snuffling, just steady breaths, close enough that he could tell it wasn't inside the house, but it wasn't far. When he looked out the window, he saw nothing. The following night, the sound returned. This time, both adults were awake, and they heard movement circling the house, pausing near windows, and then continuing on. The couple did not hear scratching or attempts to enter, but the pacing itself felt intentional. On the third night, the wife looked out to the kitchen window after hearing movement near the back door. She later reported seeing a tall, upright figure standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. She could make out the outline of its body and its head clear enough to tell this was not a bear and it was not a person. She said the head appeared elongated with ears that stood upright, and the shoulders were far too broad for a human frame. The figure did not approach the house. It stood there for several seconds and then stepped backwards into the darkness. After that night, the family stopped opening the curtains after dark. They kept lights on throughout the house and slept in shifts for several weeks. The husband began keeping a firearm beside their bed as well. They eventually moved. Another report involves a truck driver traveling through a remote stretch of road in Mississippi in the early morning hours. He had pulled over briefly to check his load when he noticed movement in his side mirror. Well, at first he thought it was a dog approaching the truck. And when he stepped down from the cab, he realized whatever it was stood nearly as tall as the cab itself. He described the figure as upright, covered in dark hair, with long arms that hung well past its waist. The head was canine in shape, and the eyes reflected light even without a direct beam. The driver backed away slowly and climbed back into the cab, locking the door behind him. As he did, the figure moved closer to the truck, stopping near the front tire, and he reported seeing it lean forward slightly as though it was inspecting the vehicle. He started the engine and pulled away without checking his mirrors until he was back on the road. When he did finally look, he saw the figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the truck leave. He later said what disturbed him most was how close it had come without making any sound he could hear from inside the cab. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from a family living on a wooded property in Pennsylvania. The parents reported hearing movement outside the house late at night for several weeks. At first, they assumed it was wildlife. Over time, they began to notice that the sounds occurred most often when the house was quiet and the lights were off. One night, their young child came into the bedroom and told them someone was standing outside their window. Well, the father checked immediately and saw nothing. Later that same night, while sitting in the living room, he noticed movement reflected on the television screen. When he turned towards the window, he saw a tall, dark figure standing just beyond the glass. He said the face was close enough that he could see the outline of a muzzle and the shape of upright ears. The figure remained there for several seconds before stepping away. Well, the family did not sleep in that house again. They stayed with relatives and returned during daylight hours to gather their belongings. In encounters like these, witnesses often say the same thing afterwards, that the presence was deliberate, that it didn't rush or behave erratically, and that it seemed to understand exactly how close it could come without crossing a line that would force a confrontation. For many of them, that realization is worse than any sudden attack could have been, because it suggests patience and even cunning, and patience implies time. Not all close proximity encounters unfold in the same way. Some don't involve a single moment at all, but a series of moments and decisions that leave the witness realizing, only afterward, how little control they actually had. In the following accounts, the distance closes without warning, and once it does, the encounters refuse to resolve quickly. This encounter comes from a couple traveling through a remote stretch of highway in Missouri late at night. They were returning home from visiting family and had chosen a back route just to avoid traffic. The road was narrow, bordered by trees on both sides with long stretches between intersections. The passengers first noticed something moving ahead on the right side of the road. At first, the driver assumed it was just a deer preparing to cross. Well, she slowed slightly, scanning the tree line, and as they drew closer, it became clear that the movement wasn't angled towards the road. It was moving parallel to them. Well, the figure remained just inside the trees, matching their speed. The driver reduced speed further, just trying to get a clearer look without actually stopping. As the headlights illuminated more of the forest edge, they both saw the same thing. A tall, upright figure moving on two legs. Consistent to the other reports, the body was covered in dark hair. The arms hung low, swinging slightly as it moved. The head was forward-facing with a long muzzle that was clearly visible when it was turned slightly towards the road. Well, neither of the people in the car spoke. The driver later said that what disturbed her the most was how effortlessly it kept pace with the vehicle at slow speed. There was no stumbling, no hesitation, and no sound they could hear from inside the car. When the driver accelerated, the figure accelerated as well. It didn't close the distance, but it didn't fall behind either. This continued for several seconds before the figure veered deeper into the trees and disappeared from view. The driver did not slow down again until it was reached a well-lit stretch of road several miles later. They did not discuss what they had seen until they were safely home, and both later confirmed the same details independently. Another close proximity report comes from a man living alone in a wooded property in West Virginia. His house sat on a hillside overlooking a narrow gravel road with a dense forest behind it. He'd lived there for over a decade and was very accustomed to wildlife moving through the area, especially at night. One evening, while sitting in his living room, he noticed movement outside the front window. We assumed it was just a deer passing through the yard and stood up just to get a better look. What he actually saw caused him to step back immediately. Standing near the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light, was a tall, upright figure facing the house. And the man later described the silhouette as broad and muscular, with long arms and a head shape that appeared canine rather than human. The figure did not move when he noticed it. It stood still, facing the house, as though aware that it had been seen. Well, the man turned off the interior lights and remained out of sight, watching from behind the curtain. After several seconds, the figure began to move slowly across the yard, stopping briefly beneath the front window before continuing towards the side of the house. He said the footsteps were heavy but controlled and not hurried. The figure circled the house once and then moved back towards the forest, disappearing into the trees behind the property. The following night, it returned. This time, the man heard movement near the back of the house first. He did not look outside immediately. When he finally did, he saw the same figure standing near the tree line facing the house again. Well, this pattern repeated over several nights. The figure never approached the doors. It never attempted to enter. It just simply appeared, remained visible long enough to be noticed, and then it withdrew. The man later said that what unsettled him the most was the sense that the presence wanted him to know that it was there. After the fourth night, he stayed with a friend for several days, and when he returned, the activity had stopped. He eventually moved off the property. In encounters like these, witnesses say the same thing afterward. The fear doesn't come from sudden movement or overt aggression. It comes from how close it gets without anything actually happening. From the realization that whatever is present understands distance, timing, and reaction, and seems to adjust its behavior accordingly. For many witnesses, that realization strips away any remaining sense of control. Because when something can get close enough to be seen clearly and choose not to act, the question of why becomes impossible to ignore. For many witnesses, the encounter itself isn't the hardest part to live with. It's what comes afterward. In the days and weeks following these experiences, people often describe a lingering sense that something has shifted. Not just in the environment around them, but in the way that they relate to familiar places and routines. Several witnesses report becoming hyper-aware of their surroundings, especially at night. Sounds they once ignored now command their full attention. A branch snapping in the woods, a shape moving at the edge of a headlight beam, or the feeling of being watched while standing in a doorway can trigger immediate anxiety. Some people begin altering their habits without consciously realizing it at first. They stop sitting outside after dark. They avoid certain roads. They keep lights on longer than they used to. In rural areas, witnesses often describe changes that are more practical. Firearms that were once kept locked away are moved closer at night. Exterior lighting is installed where none existed before. Dogs are brought inside earlier, sometimes refusing to go back out at all. One witness from Tennessee reported that after his encounter, he began locking his doors during the day, something he had never done in over 20 years of living on that same property. He said the habit wasn't driven by fear of people, but by the sense that whatever he had seen didn't behave like an animal that could be predicted. Another witness described how the woods behind her home no longer felt neutral. She said it wasn't that she believed something was always there, but that the area no longer felt empty in the way that it once had. Even during daylight hours, she found herself scanning the tree line unconsciously. In some cases, the effects reach beyond individual behavior. Families report tension when one person wants to talk about what happened and another would rather forget it entirely. Children who witnessed or sensed something unusual may develop anxiety around bedtime or refuse to sleep alone. Pets that were once comfortable outdoors become skittish or aggressive after dark. A few witnesses report experiencing recurring dreams tied to their encounters. Not always vivid recreations, but fragments, movement in trees, eyes reflected light, or the feeling of standing still where something approaches slowly. Perhaps most telling is how many people describe a reluctance to revisit the location where the encounter occurred. Hunters abandon stands that they've used for years. Drivers take longer routes to avoid certain stretches of the road. Property owners sell land that they once planned to keep for life. When asked why, many struggle to articulate a clear reason beyond a simple statement. It just doesn't feel right anymore. And for some, the question that lingers the longest isn't what they saw. It's why the encounter ended the way it did. Why the presence remained at a distance. Why it approached, but it didn't advance further. Why it seemed to withdraw on its own terms. That uncertainty stays with people. Because if the experience had been random, a brief chaotic moment, it would probably be easier to dismiss. But many witnesses are left with the impression that the encounter stopped, not because it had to, but because it chose to. Before we reach the end of tonight's episode, it's really important to say this very clearly. The encounters discussed here are drawn from reported witness accounts. They come from individuals who came forward independently, often years after the events took place, and who had no connection to each other at the time of their experiences. These accounts are presented as they were reported. No attempt has been made to fictionalize or embellish them, and no claim is being made about what these witnesses encountered beyond their own descriptions. As with all reports of unexplained phenomena, listeners are encouraged to draw your own conclusions. For the people who experience these encounters, they're isn't always a clear ending. Life goes on. Days pass. The woods remain where they've always been. But something changes in the way those places are remembered. Once you've stood in a familiar space and felt watched without seeing why, it's difficult to return to the same sense of ease, even when nothing happens again. The memory of that moment stays close, quietly reshaping how safe, normal feels. Many of the witnesses you've heard about tonight don't claim to understand what they encountered. Most of them aren't looking for answers or explanations. They're simply trying to make sense of an experience that didn't fit into the world that they thought they knew. And for some of them, the most unsettling part isn't the figure itself. It's the realization that it noticed them first. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up for us today. So hope you guys enjoyed the show, and thank you again so much for all your love and support. And remember, if you want to follow the Paranormal Portal, probably the easiest way is to head over to paranormalportal.net. And that's the homepage for the Paranormal Portal. And you'll find links to all of our different social media and sites and information about the shows, including our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/paranormalportal. Or just look for Paranormal Portal on Google or whatever search engine, and you'll find links to our social media such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. So we're kind of all over the place, and we're spreading as well as we can. But anyway, thank you so much for the love and support. Y'all take care, and remember, we love y'all. Be good, be kind, be nice. Take care of each other, help each other out, find the magic in every day, and remember to laugh as much as you can. Until next time.